A thing you wish was real, because can you imagine you learn a technique and you can read, I read about a page a minute for difficult texts, right? And speed reading promised me 4 times that speed, 4 pages a minute. Amazing. But speed reading cannot work on books like this. And furthermore, if you are trying to do what I'm suggesting, which is to enjoy reading long and difficult books, then speed reading is not going to get you there. The way speed reading is supposed to work is you scan, they tell you to go on a diagonal kind of, and you scan going like this and looking for the main nouns, and then go back to look for the verbs that connect them, and ignore adjectives and adverbs and connecting words. If you're trying to get the most out of a manual to your VCR, remember what those were? Okay, if you're trying to get the most out of a manual, perhaps that might get you there. But from a literary text, it's just, it doesn't apply. So I'm sorry to tell you the speed reading isn't real. I did go global. About 5 years into it, I felt like I had really mastered the canon. At this point, I was reading the secondary novels, the plays that aren't as well known. So I needed to go outside. So where did I go? Japan has a very rich literature, which I explored as best I could. India, modern Indian writing, turned out to be really interesting. There was one book, it's slipping my mind, it's got this beautiful gun on the cover, but India had a lot to offer. South American, Latin American books, there is such a great tradition, starting with Borges and Mario Vargas Llosa, Fuentes. There's really a lot available. And you have to remember, I also was able to read in other languages. I can read in French poorly, so that opened up a little bit for me. Like there's this guy called Welbeck, that's spelled Houellebecq. He's this really dirty French writer. He was on, it's really bad. It's really something that'll curl your toes. You thought the Marquis de Sade was bad. But I was able to read French stuff somewhat like that. But the Russian, I can read Russian fluently. Modern Russian literature, I've also somewhat kind of mastered, and that I've really got a good grip on. But what were you thinking of? What were you actually, give me an example of what you meant by going global.
Well, an example is from the perception of understanding, introducing how these truly difficult books let you understand Western thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So the reverse from more global thinking. So an example would be, use India as an example. You use religious texts like the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana, or the Tale of Genji for Japan, which was the first book ever.
Since so many of the books that would fit the category you brought up are religious texts, I cannot say that I really focused on them, because I cannot give you the same rationale for reading interesting books about the Bhagavad Gita, because there's something called the Shahnameh from Persia. It's 10 volumes, but the stories are often repetitive. It's like reading the 1001 Arabian Nights. It turns out that a lot of it is the same. That's why there's little collections that are like best of that work very well. But for understanding the thought of other cultures, it is good to read what they consider good. For example, in Turkey, there's a writer named Orhan Pamuk. Ever hear of him? He won the Nobel Prize. I read several of his books, and after getting through the famous ones, I read one about his home city, Istanbul, and all of a sudden I got it. I felt like, okay, I got Turkey under my belt. I know it now. Maybe might be wrong, but I felt that I had understood it. And it was through reading. But Orhan Pamuk is very interesting to read. You want to know how it ends. There's a murder. You want to know who did it. You cannot quite say the same about the Bhagavad Gita. So, any other question before I move on to Proust? The one book I want to talk about before I turn it over to you is the one that had the largest effect on me. And I'll explain why. And it's also the longest one. It's really considered the longest book of all. It's called The Remembrance of Things Past, or sometimes translated In Search of Lost Time, because the French name is À la recherche du temps perdu. And it's by Marcel Proust. And it's one of the big three of modernism. You know, the other two are Joyce and Kafka. Musil is probably the fourth. Do you agree?
Yeah.
The big shots of modernism. Proust, it's in 7 volumes. That being said, there are very, very brilliant critics in the world, and they're not necessarily the ones in classrooms. So every book that is important has been addressed by one critic or another. So if you are ever unhappy with the way a book is taught, but you suspect that the book is worth being taught perhaps differently, I would Google it, Google criticism of Great Gatsby, and you'll eventually reach, someone like David Trilling or Nabokov. Great writers write on other books all the time, and that might be what you're looking for. And it's not that they're not long. I mean, there's short works of criticism that are quite brilliant. I just would avoid the criticism that has ideological points of view. For example, Marx. Leon Trotsky wrote a book called On Literature and War, and tried to argue that works of literature are like offensives in wars, right? But it didn't work, and works of literature are not war. So that's why ideological criticism is sometimes wrong.
I wanted to say something about The Great Gatsby, because it's an interesting, and I think probably everybody here read it in high school, right? It's like a national, I think everybody has to read it. And I loved it. I went through high school calling this girl that I was in love with Daisy, right? I mean, this was like a code word with me and my friends. We used to talk about Daisy. This is the one that we were dating, then we broke up, then we started dating again. And it was really the book where at least one of the characters in the book really was a part of my life. And then I read it a few years ago, and it didn't have that same effect. And it's just interesting that to be disappointed in a book that you think meant so much. It doesn't make it so that it didn't mean as much to you then, but it sort of, falls. It's a real letdown when that happens.
I've had that happen both in your example and in the opposite example. I used to think that On the Road by Jack Kerouac was a great work that everyone should read to understand the spirit of youth and rebellion and just go, go, go. And then I reread it about 10 years later, and I thought, oh my God, how embarrassing. Because it's poorly written, and Kerouac is a bit of a poser and a show-off. But worst of all, I just can't imagine I'd like this. This is a guy who's, too short, wearing heels. It's just awful. But I was also, Naked Lunch was one of the, definitely the books that formed me, and it formed my sense of humor almost completely. I basically just borrowed it, right? So recently, about a year ago, I bought this beautifully slipcased edition of Naked Lunch. It was the 50th anniversary edition. And I reread it. And I was so afraid I would hate it. But I didn't. It made me laugh. It was dark. And I actually understood much more than I did before. So I guess different books have different effects. You know what else? Vonnegut. When I was 13 or 14, I just read them all. I got all the paperbacks, and I read God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, all the way to Play Your Piano and all the rest of them. And then I actually got to meet Vonnegut. He was drunk and cheerful, and it was really cool because I still liked him then. So recently, not so recently, 3 years ago, I found a copy of Cat's Cradle And I thought, oh, this will be so nice. I loved this book when I was a kid. I'm going to read it. And I read it. Oh, it's no good. It's no good. It's simplistic and it's boring. So I guess it does depend on who you are. You know, it's 10 to 7. Do you have other questions? Ask anything. Go ahead. You guys want to know how to stab somebody? I'll tell you. Any reasons? The biggest reason why it was not like any situation I've ever seen is because the characters in it behaved, their motivations were ideological. They did things because of what they believed in, right? That is not how people in prison do things. It's like they talk about violence in prison, about the nature of it, saying that it has to be prevented, making it sound like these guys just can't help themselves. They just want to fight. That's not how it happens at all. Violence in prison is for a reason. It's because somebody owes money usually. It's not over beliefs. So Morgan Freeman's character, he's a fantasy. I wish there were people like this, but there aren't. And of course his victory is another problem. You don't see too many of those. You know, they had those two guys escape from Clinton last summer. You know, one's dead, the other one's going to be in the box for the rest of his life. So
do you tend to avoid, I think, TV shows or movies or books about prison?
No. First of all, the books, I just read them all. I read all the prison books that I could find. With TV shows, I mean, Orange is the New Black did a pretty good job. Do you want to know what I think is the best description of prison written? I did find one that really made an impression on me, and I never would have expected where it came from. It wasn't from somebody who was in prison. It wasn't a memoir. It was Tom Wolfe.
Man Full?
Yes.
That's one of my favorite books of all time.
As it should be.
I've probably read that 5 times.
Really? I reread Epictetus because of, okay, Tom Wolfe, he wrote Bonfire of the Vanities, right? He's this southern guy who lives over there. He lives on Columbus Circle. He always wears white suits. He played with the hippies a lot. I don't think he ever actually did drugs though. But Bonfire of the Vanities.
Did he write poems?
Did he write? No, you're thinking of Thomas Wolfe, right? No, but he wrote Bonfire of the Vanities, which was the big 80s book. It really captured the 80s very well. But the book that Ross likes so much, Man Full, is it's about many things. It's really about Georgia. It's about Atlanta in many ways. But there's a good 150-page chunk of it that's set in prison because the character ends up going in. And he has a rough time in there because there's people being raped. And he ends up escaping. It's a deus ex machina because there's an earthquake and he gets out. But even that's, I forgive it completely because he described it so well, the fear and the terror. And the character, he's obsessed, or not obsessed, but he likes the Stoics. And one of the Stoics is called named Epictetus, who describes how to live in adversity, how to survive when things are bad. And Tom Wolfe masterfully weaves that in to the prison story. And after I finished A Man in Full, I went back to the library and I pulled out Epictetus and read that again. And this time I really understood it. Why do you enjoy it so?
Well, first of all, I felt like I learned something about the Vietnamese community in California and the city of Atlanta and
Horsemen.
That's an amazing scene.
Mm-hmm.
There's an amazing scene where he talks about how prize horses, and they don't do this